to introduce today's speakers, Dr. Juliet Vogel and Dr. Bill Saltzman. Dr. Vogel has been working on a project on the implications of family resilience for families experiencing terrorism and disaster with Dr. Betty Pfefferbaum for the University of Oklahoma Terrorism and Disaster Center of the National Traumatic Stress Network. She has been affiliated with the NCTSN since its inception, working initially with the North Shore Long Island Jewish Health System site in Manhasset, New York. She is fortunately still affiliated with the North Shore Health System. She served as Director of Training from their Division of Trauma Psychiatry from 2007 to 2010 and was also Project Director of several grant-supported programs that serve children and families affected by the 9/11 terrorist attacks. She's a doctorate in developmental psychology as well as training in child and family clinical psychology. Dr. Bill Saltzman is a clinical psychologist and the Associate Director for the Focus Program at the UCLA Semel Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior. For the past 18 years, Dr. Saltzman has developed and implemented trauma and loss focus programs for children, adolescents, and families contending with disaster, war, community violence, and medical trauma. Dr. Saltzman is a professor of counseling at California State University Long Beach and is on staff with the UCLA Child and Family Trauma Psychiatry Service. I'm pleased to hand over today's presentation to Dr. Vogel.
Thank you, Jennifer. Before I start, I want to emphasize that what I am presenting is collaborative work with Betty Pfefferbaum. The plan today is that I will present a theoretical overview, and then Bill Saltzman will pick up with some more applied aspects of work with family resilience. If I could have the first content slide, I'm going to talk for a moment about individual resilience, even though this is a presentation on family resilience, because the work on individual resilience provides important conceptual background. The work on individual resilience has a longer history, beginning about 40 years ago, with a series of findings of individuals who did extremely well in spite of growing up under conditions of strong adversity. These were offspring of schizophrenic parents, children raised in poverty, and children raised with other significant risk factors such as exposure to ongoing community violence. When people started talking about resilience, they initially thought about it as a permanent characteristic of certain individuals who at times were talked about as invulnerable. But with time, people realized that it was not in the individual, but rather as a process that's dependent on a range of factors, including the specific circumstances of stress at a particular time, and that one can look at risk and protective factors. Then they began to identify a short list of protective factors that came up again and again in the research on individual resilience. Some of them were characteristics such as intelligence, but one of the key ones was a context factor and a relationship one, namely, for a child, the presence in the child's life of a supportive adult figure. Typically, this was a family member, but it wasn't always a family member. And I flagged that in red on the slide because that becomes a bridge between the work on individual resilience and family resilience. And finally, more recently, there's been increasing attention to resilience at multiple system levels, not just individual resilience, but also family resilience, community resilience, and looking at the interaction of those levels. Next slide, please. The next slide comes from Walsh's work, and basically it's a picture of a family, a house under pressure. And the point of this is that we look to families to support individuals, like children. The family itself as a unit may be under stress. So how is the family going to be resilient to take care of young when everyone's under stress? And also, the family as a system is worthy of looking at and saying, how can we help families as units to function in a variety of domains when they are under stress? Next slide, please. So conceptually, when we shift to the family level, there are three bodies of work that seem to Betty and me to be the most important contributors to current perspectives on family resilience. First is the work on individual resilience that I just referred to. There are also, though, two family-level bodies of work that contribute directly to understanding of family resilience. The first comes from a family therapy tradition and is represented in Frommo Walsh's work. Up to the 1970s, family therapy theory tended to look at the ways in which families provided negative impact rather than strengths. In the 1970s, people started looking to families as resources, and even when individuals or families came in distressed, there was an increasing emphasis on looking at the ways in which the strengths of the family might contribute to future functioning for the family and its members. In that tradition, Frommo Walsh has talked about family resilience. A second contributing family-level contribution is a tradition of work on family stress and coping, and the bridging of that work and family resilience theory and research has been done primarily by Joan Patterson, some also by Hamilton McCubbin. It's a tradition that dates back to World War II, when Reuben Hill did work on coping in families who had experienced wartime separation, and then McCubbin and Patterson developed further theory about stress and coping, and Patterson then has bridged that with concepts of family resilience. Next slide, please. So how do we define family resilience? And I'll give you a definition from Walsh and one from Patterson, and then talk a bit about the components of the definition. According to Walsh, it's an active process of endurance, self-righting, and growth in response to crisis and challenge. For Patterson, it's an ongoing, often emergent process in families, not a stable trait. It's similar to family regenerative power when good outcomes follow significant risk situations. Next slide, please. And continuing to look at the definitions, you have then a family that is withstanding or overcoming a major stressor. It could be a focal severe stressor, such as the impact of 9/11 or Hurricane Katrina. It could be a chronic stressor, such as poverty or community violence. It could be a combination of both, as was the case for many of the poorer residents of New Orleans after Katrina. There's also the question, are you talking about resilience when families are dealing with normative transitions? And there, the theorists say that sometimes you get such a pileup of stressors with a normative transition that to come through those functioning well should be considered resilience. And one of the examples used for that is take the transition to parenthood that involves a young, unmarried, teenage mother who has limited resources. Next slide, please. Okay, so what are some of the major attributes of family resilience? First of all, it's a process that occurs over time. At one instant, a family may not appear resilient, but they may be working on coping, and you may have to look over time. Second, it often involves what's called bouncing forward, and that's Frommo Walsh's term. Namely, the family that is sort of righting itself after a severe stress doesn't necessarily look identical to the way that family looked before the stressor. There may need to be adjustment. The situation may be different, even though there's some continuity with where you were before. I had the opportunity at the 10th anniversary of 9/11 to talk with people who talked about how the events of 9/11 had changed the trajectory of their lives and their families' lives for some families. Okay. Third, the same stressor will have a different impact on different families, depending on a range of characteristics, such as the developmental stage of the members and of the life cycle of the family itself, or the resources the family brings to bear. You need to look at resilience factors as well in cultural context. Two examples. As I go on, I'll talk more about family cohesion, the family's ability to pull together and support each other around a significant stressor. There are cultural differences in the extent to which families pull together and function closely as a unit. So one needs to take that into account in looking at cohesion under times of stress. Similarly, there are different cultural beliefs at who is responsible for handling a stressor. For example, Hamilton McCubbin talks about Native American beliefs about handling a family situation in which a child has a disability. And in the Hawaiian families with whom he's worked, there has been a cultural expectation that it's the community rather than the family as a nuclear family that's responsible for handling that kind of situation. Next slide, please. So how do we know that a family's been resilient? What outcomes does one want to look at? Froma Walsh has been primarily addressing clinicians, including family therapists, and she gives a definition that a family can heal from painful wounds, take charge of their lives, and go on to live fully and love well. In other words, for her, it's not simply enough to go through the motions of doing what a family needs to do, but there is a kind of positive aspect to it of really being able to re-engage in life in spite of having dealt with adversity. And we've seen this in 9/11 affected families, that for some it's been a struggle, but you get to a point where you can go on and really live a life in spite of losses. For Patterson, there are functions from family sociology of what a family needs to accomplish. Membership, family formation, and I'd add preservation of family membership. So when you have, let's say, a child with a significant disability, can the family pull together and agree on a direction, or is the stress of different perspectives such that the family falls apart? There's a classic movie, Ordinary People, where a teenager has died in a drowning accident, and there is a remaining younger sibling, also a teenager, and the father is able to join with that younger sibling and support him, but the mother somehow can't forgive that child for having lived when the other one died. And so that family does not really maintain basic membership. For the next three, I'm going to use Hurricane Katrina as an example. The family's ability to fill its roles of educating and nurturing the young, taking care of vulnerable members, such as elderly or people who are ill, and economic support of members. The reason I'm going to use Katrina as an example is think about the role of the community and the amount of devastation that exists in the community. So if you don't have an economic system functioning at a particular point in time, the hospitals are not available, or the nursing homes to take care of the vulnerable, the schools are closed, then the jobs of the family to do these basic functions is much, much more difficult. So you've got tremendous interplay across levels in terms of resilience. Now, another issue that comes up in the literature is for a specific kind of risk factor. There may be specific issues one wants to keep an eye out for because they're known risk factors. For example, when you have a family with a child with a disability, can the parents attend to that disability and also attend to the needs of other family members, including other children, siblings? Or do they somehow, the siblings end up feeling like they get lost along the way? Next slide, please. I want to talk now about the processes that have been identified in a variety of contexts as key for facilitating resilience in families. The first is a cognitive one, appraisal of the situation, of the resources, and meaning-making. Second, the family's ability to cope by using resources both inside and outside the family. Third, organizational patterns of the family. Fourth, communication communication strategies, including both communication about information and communication about feelings. And finally, problem solving. Next slide, please. And I apologize that this is a very busy slide. I'll try to distill it for you. But Joan Patterson comes up with a very interesting model of how families come to need to use their resilience and what are some of the key components. That basically one is constantly as a family, probably also as an individual, balancing demands and capabilities. On one side, you can think of a balance beam, and I'll show you the beam in a moment. You have the current major stressors. You also have the daily hassles that always go on, and strains, which are family issues that come from not quite resolved solutions to old problems. So that's on one side of the balance. On the other side are capabilities, your resources internal to the family and external to the family, an extended family community, and your coping strategies. But mediating them is your belief systems and your appraisals. So that what's critical is not necessarily the actual demands, but the family's perception of the demands. And similarly, it's not just objective resources, but your perception of what you have available. When you have a perception that the demands slightly exceed the resources, you make minor adjustments and the family goes on. But when there is a major mismatch, then you have a crisis and you need resilience. And that can come by modifying the actual demands. It can come from modifying the perception of the demands. And it can come from, again, modifying resources or perceptions. That's a little bit abstract, so let me give you a specific example. If you have a family in which a member has a chronic or a significant illness, such as cancer, at some point the family is focusing on finding the best experts to get the best cure. At a certain point, the family may come to realize that this is really a terminal illness and it's not going to do any good to keep seeking more medical opinions, that what the best solution to the situation is to make the life that remains for the terminally ill person as comfortable as possible and to make it as meaningful for the family as possible. Okay, next slide, please. Now I'm showing you Patterson's balance beam, where you can see at the top the demands are exceeding the capabilities, the meanings are mediating how much is in or out of balance. There is a crisis, and then somehow the meanings of the demands and capabilities are adjusted so that they're back in balance, but probably a somewhat different balance from what you had before. Continue to the next slide, please. So what kind of family belief systems and meaning-making tends to facilitate resilience? I've mentioned cohesion before, viewing a crisis as a shared challenge with family members seeking to support each other. That's exactly what did not happen in the Ordinary People movie example I talked about before. It happened with the father and remaining son, but not with the mother. Accepting that distress and difficulties are understandable under the circumstances. This is what we deal with in psychoeducation in many types of trauma treatment, including hope, but this is a special kind of hope. It's with goals and visions of success that address mastery of what you can control and acceptance of those things that you cannot. Or, as Walsh talks about it, mastering the art of the possible. And I gave an example of that with the terminal illness example. It avoids focus on blame, shame, and guilt. It doesn't leave you with a future perspective dominated by catastrophic fears. And very important for many families is the connection to a belief system larger than the family and its own troubles. It can be a religion, but it doesn't have to be religious beliefs. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to shift gears now from beliefs to how the family functions or family organization. Families do well when they can preserve routines and rituals, particularly for children, but for the adults as well. Continuity is important. At the same time, flexibility is important to adapt to the new circumstances. one can't do everything the way one always did it. I remember an example of a mother whose view was you always take care of every detail in terms, including ironing the children's underwear. That doesn't work well under certain circumstances of acute stress. So to the extent that one needs to modify and be flexible, that's the bouncing forward I talked about before. The connectedness, the mutual support and commitment, but also respect within that for individual differences. An example after 9/11 was a family we worked with that had adolescent twins whose father had died. One twin wanted pictures of her father and reminders, and her side of the room was plastered with pictures. The other twin was an avoider and did not have any family pictures on her side of the bedroom. Those styles both needed to be respected and accommodated at the same time that the family pulled together to support each other. There's also a respect for boundaries and hierarchy on two levels. First of all, within the family, that the adults are taking charge. They are using children to be helpful within their developmental level, developmentally appropriate responsibility. David Pelcovitz talks about required helpfulness for teenagers as a very important factor, and there's support for that from the work that Glenn Elder did with children of the Great Depression. But they have to be within the range of what the youngsters can do and doesn't swamp their developmental needs. There's another kind of boundaries, though, and that is the boundaries with the outside helpers. John Patterson talks about that in situations of medical trauma, that there may be outside medical experts coming to support the family, and you need to deal with the support in a way that doesn't overwhelm the family's own structure. Similarly, for those of us who've worked after disasters and the role of FEMA and other community supports, the same balancing act exists. Emotional expression, sharing a wide range of emotions. You need to have the capacity for having moments of fun, for positive communication. The adults in the family, though, can also be tremendously important role models of how one can be distressed and appropriately express distress without doing it in a maladaptive way. And finally, effective problem solving. Bill will talk more about that, I believe, but that's problem solving within and beyond the family. Next slide, please. Okay, so let me summarize the themes that I've raised so far: the importance of meaning-making, appraisals, beliefs in supporting members, belief in a worldview, and reconciling what's happened with your extended worldview. Your ability to recruit resources outside and inside the family, so that's the interface between the family level and the individual and community levels. Balancing of structure and flexibility, providing for the needs of the member, effective communication within the family and outside the family. And finally, we're dealing with the temporal dimension. The processes most critical for resilience may change over time after a major stressor. Next slide, please. And now I'm on Wright's work, and this is, from my perspective, a pilot study, but a very suggestive one. What she did was do in-depth interviews with 6 families who had identified having had a major stressor and having come through it. And what she found was that there were phases of reaction. She calls them stages, but they're not necessarily time-linked, where initially you're focusing on survival, then you need to make adaptations. You accept with time that there's a new reality, that as you grow stronger, you find meaning, and finally you may turn to helping others. As you go through those phases or stages, you're calling on different processes. So initially, for survival, you need to get support, you need to take charge, and you may call upon your spirituality. But changing your beliefs about family structure comes later in the process. I'm not going to go through the different processes for each of these stages, but just that this is a set of processes that happen over time, and you need different coping resources at different points. So, in conclusion, family resilience, and this is a slide that's called resilience, it's called conclusions, that family resilience involves supporting the resilience of its members, but it involves more. There is a focus on general family functioning. Specific issues on which to focus may vary depending on the type of stressor, the timeline post-stressor, and cultural and developmental issues. And you need to look at the family embedded in a range of systems and looking at the challenges and supports within the family from its members, within the community from the larger community. Last slide. So if you're looking at factors influencing children, we need, on the research end, to move beyond simply looking at correlations between child and parent functioning to look at family processes and family-level functionings, the mechanisms that link the levels, and the resources that may be helpful to drive family functioning, resources from the larger community. Again, a reminder about cultural and developmental factors for family organization and belief systems, and that if we want to look at this clinically or research-wise, we need to look over time. I thank you very much, and I want to turn this over to Bill now.
Thank you, Juliet. Wonderful job kind of laying a nice foundation for us and staying within your time restraints. Awesome. Yeah, I'll take about 25 minutes now to go over more kind of a application of some of this theory. Keep in mind we're saving about 15 minutes or so at the end for to engage in responses to your questions as well. Well, really, we're at a unique point in time in which, based on some of the research that Juliet shared with you in terms of advances in our understanding of the specific, structure and mechanisms of family resilience, we have a sense of what keeps families' ability to protect themselves and to be a primary context for recovery of the family members themselves. So we've got an emerging science of family resilience, coupled with a lot of the developments that are taking place in the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, which include the manualization of interventions, the ability to do like through the Learning Collaborative and other technologies, how to implement large-scale programs with fidelity. So given that we're at a unique place right now in which we can develop programs that can draw upon resilience, the science of resilience, and to put it in the field. Now, what I've been doing for the last 9 years, really, is working on family resilience enhancement programs to address child trauma and loss. And the idea was, instead of focusing more narrowly on child symptoms or pathology, was to really target family functioning, and specifically resilient family functioning. I've done that through the FOCUS program, and some of you might be familiar with that in terms of, our military application. And, in truth, we are in the field throughout the active duty service, all the service branches. But really, the program was initially started in medical settings. We expanded it for post-disaster work, post-Katrina, working in New Orleans and other places. And then, of course, with the military expansion, but now we're working through the Departments of Mental Health in California, and we're using this type of approach of a resilience enhancement for a really wide spectrum of trauma and loss presentations. Next slide. Our starting point is really this general point that I think Juliet really eloquently idea that the family is the primary context for protection and recovery from trauma and loss experiences. This also contains the idea that its enhancement efforts can function both as primary or universal prevention, as well as be used for more secondary or even tertiary types of prevention, cases in which there are existing difficulties, stress injuries, pathology, and to provide that context for recovery. Next slide. And the way to do this is really to try to understand the ways in which trauma, parental distress, and impairment breaches the protective barrier of the family and undermines those core family resilient processes. So I just wanted you to have a visual to look at that, how the family, an intact, a family that has many of the characteristics described by Julie, it protects its members. And the idea here is how can we either try to rebuild or bring back online those resilient processes when they are breached or undermined, or really try to jumpstart those in families that have not had them previously. Next slide. And something that's been helpful for me is to really cull the literature, looking at different types of either anecdotal or clinical research that describes families under stress. What is the kind of the negative chain reaction that happens in families that undermines those family resilient processes? And here's one example. This is the circumstance in which you might have a parent who has post-traumatic stress. And that's something, of course, we deal with a lot in the military scenarios, but also others as well. So the parent can have, the hallmarks of emotional numbing and detachment, irritability, sometimes even, becoming aggressive. There's increased conflict in the home. Sometimes we also find there can be, relapse into maybe overprotective or inflexible parenting styles. This can come in the wake of a traumatic event, whether it be disaster, community event, or even just a family-level type of a crisis. You can see these kind of switches in the parenting. This then can cascade into reduced communication, reduced ability for the parent to track with the children. Of course, we know that that's a key thing for them to be engaged in the child's life, to be responsive in appropriate ways. Sometimes the traumatically stressed parent is unable to tolerate normal activities, just even the conflict or the rough and tumble in the home. There can be increased prickliness and conflict. And bottom line is often, and this is what we see in military families, but also post-disaster families in which a parent is very stressed or maybe is even depressed, they take themselves out in key ways in terms of their involvement in the life and their responsiveness, their engagement in the daily, life of the family. This reduced family closeness and support all hits the bottom line, which is the resilience potential of the family. Next slide. So the task is to identify the short list of characteristics of stressed or traumatized families that put family members at risk for poor, immediate, and long-term adaptation. And what we try to do in developing a pragmatic program is to identify the most salient mechanisms of risk for families and the ones that are most amenable to change. And that's where we get this list, which is really a distillation of Patterson and Walsh's work, and then looking at a lot of studies and descriptions of families under stress. So let me go through these briefly. It overlaps a lot with many of the categories that Julia described, but they also have a little slightly more operationalized focus. The idea that an incomplete understanding of the impact of the stressor condition, whether it be a trauma, death, or illness, or injury, and inaccurate developmental expectations. There's often, those of you who've worked post-trauma or just with folks dealing with even specific crisis events, there can often be a lack of appreciation of the seriousness of what they've been through, and perhaps a lack of understanding of the immediate and long-term repercussions of either the parent stress or the impact on the child. And sometimes an unwillingness or inability to adjust the expectations for how they should be working and what the kids should be doing. Folks can want to just move forward in their life quickly and not give themselves the time to recover, or they might not be aware of how they're functioning as a spouse or a parent, or for the children, how it has been impacted by the traumatic stress. etc. So there can be confusion in the family in which, if a parent is irritable or acting out, and it can be confusing to the child, for instance, maybe even they blame themselves, etc. And in terms of looking at the kids, if there can be inaccurate developmental expectations of how stress plays out for the kids, they can be perhaps worrying too much about more normative type reactions, perhaps even not enough about other things that might be not on their radar. In terms of impaired communication, as Juliet mentioned, the hallmark of a resilient families is open family communication that really permits expression of emotion and provides opportunities for individuals to talk about, difficulties or painful experience. We know that when family members are distressed, there can be a tendency for communication to become rigid or blocked. And certainly we see that in military families, in which kids certainly often just kind of feel they have to suck it up themselves and not, try to burden other people. Even kids as young as 5 or 6 do this. And there can be a siloing of communication. Impaired parenting practices. Parents can be distressed, have difficulty sleeping, become irritable, have mood changes, which results in their disengaging or becoming inconsistent in their parenting practices. Family organization, I think Juliet covered that pretty well, but the idea that there are certain types of organization that are flexible and open that really support consistent care routines and appropriate support despite adversity and change. And I think Juliet covered very well the importance of guiding belief systems that can help them to make meaning of these difficult times. Next slide. So looking at the mechanisms of risk, we then have a kind of a mirror image here of the mechanisms of resilience. And very quickly, this was kind of our roadmap for designing a resilience enhancement program. We wanted to provide psychoeducation and developmental guidance that could help to provide direct and really concrete understanding of how this event has impacted them and how it might have changed their parenting and spouse functioning, and what their expectations can be for their kids and for the next step of adaptation for their family. We use a shared narrative approach that I'll describe in more detail later, in which we move from individual experiences of what the family has been through to a shared narrative to really identify misunderstandings that can really come up and be very real stumbling blocks for family support. This happens in the wake of traumatic events. We want to focus on open and effective communication, supporting effective and coordinated parent leadership, really to empower them if they felt marginalized, or if even one parent sometimes who might be depressed or traumatically stressed or overwhelmed, to try to bring them up and so they can work as an effective co-parenting team. And if you're working with a single parent, to do that as well, to help them come back online. And then there's a short list of specific resilience focused skills, family-level skills that we want to do actual skills training in, which includes such things as types of emotion regulation, problem-solving, goal-setting, and really anticipating trauma loss reminders and managing reactions. So that's our next slide, please. So that's our map for developing a program. Very briefly, this is the architecture of the program. Remember, this is an intervention that we use, yes, in military settings, but also in medical settings for all kinds of chronic illnesses, as well as invasive serious medical procedures. We're using the same program for a host of different situations in the community right now through LA County Department of Mental Health. And we find it effective with different types of tweaking of the program. So we start out working with the parents, in which we find out what's at the top of the deck for them. What do they want help with from their family? We want to hear their concerns. We elicit their narratives so that we can help them to read from the same page. Their ability to work together in a supportive fashion can be undermined by the crisis or the traumatic event itself, whether it be a disaster or a death of a family member or illness or a deployment. And so we want them to bridge their communication as well. With the children, we meet with them. We start with the training in emotion regulation, hear what their concerns are, and we elicit their narratives as well in terms of what has this before, during, and after the difficult experience been like for them. What are things that they have been unable, perhaps, to bring to the parents, things that the parents might not know about what they've been struggling with, and prepare them for the family sessions. We meet then again with the parents to prep them for the family sessions. A lot of times parents need the extra practice in terms of how to respond to the child information. You know, a lot of things might be a surprise to them. Kids can have real concerns that they don't voice. You know, or, you know, in the medical cases, you know, I've worked with a family in which mom had terminal cancer, and they hadn't communicated clearly with the family the seriousness of it, although the son was, you know, had his fears, but he was alone with his fears. You know, is mom going to die? And that's what, of course, front and center was the first question that he wanted to ask in the family session. But we want to be able to prepare the parents to respond in a helpful way, in a supportive, but also in a truthful way as well. Family sessions, 6 through 8. The initial session is to share the narratives, to address maybe misattributions, misunderstandings, to try to process that, to move from individual understanding and narratives to a shared narrative. And then the rest of the time is focused on the specific types of family-level skills that would be most helpful to that family. Next slide. You know, this is a very brief, this is one of the timelines from the initial parent sessions. This is for a military case. And I just want you to get a sense of this in terms of how we graph out the individual family member's story through this timeline here, with elevations being higher stress events and low points on the line being very low levels of stress, or actually even positive times. And with the understanding that as you go across over time, that's from left to right, the same people who could even have the exact same type of experience will have a very different, perception of it in many cases. So, for instance, very briefly, here you have a husband and wife who in the first session had shared their story. On the left, you've got before the first deployment, there was a move from back east to the west. For the mother, who's in the red, that was a very stressful move for the dad. It was not for the mom. She was moving from her family and friends. And so that was a high stress. The dad didn't know that was a high stress for her, and so it helped actually in the initial sessions to hear about that. This goes through 2 deployments. I'm not going to go through everything, but you can see there's real convergent points and divergent points. And it's those divergent points that can often be the source of misunderstandings between a husband and a wife. Do this with the rest of the family, we'll also be looking for the divergent points. Next slide. For the kids, we often do a more playful type of time map instead of timeline. This is for kids 10 and under, in which we want them kind of like almost like Candyland, a plain board here, in which they can talk about the chronology of their experience and then draw in the key events here, as well as have, like pictures of the key points, using the thermometer to note which are the high stress versus low stress. I'm going to, this is the same family in which this is the 10-year-old girl, and you'll notice that on her time map, you've got the deployment, you've got wildfires here. This is from down in Camp Pendleton, and the picture on the left there is of the fires she drew. That was, for her, that was one of the most stressful things, and the evacuation that went along with that. For Dad's, the next deployment, she drew the fact that she was fearful quite a bit of the time while Dad was away, and that's a picture of her and her mom hiding behind furniture as robbers broke into the house. And then the last picture of her and her dad on boogie boards and surfboards out there, that was her hope for when Dad came back, that they'd be able to spend some positive time together. And she was disappointed that Dad, when he did come back, he was very kind of distracted and disengaged, and so that made her sad. You can't read that on a thermometer, but that's one of the things she had there. The idea is these are materials to be brought to the family session. And we share these with the parents in the session 5 so that they get kind of a heads up on how to respond. But it's also important for the parents to know, for instance, that, that for the father who got angry at his daughter, that she still, that she had to come home from school because they had a fire drill, it's helpful for him to know that this deal with the fire and evacuation was a big deal and still is a big deal for her. That she's still fearful when he goes away, and that she is sad that she's not having more time with him. Next slide. The specific skills that Juliet alluded to that we found very useful, and actually the literature identifies that these are kind of core capacities in the family that can help them to work together in that collaborative and cohesive way that serves the bottom line of family resilience. Emotion regulation, goal setting, the ability to problem solve together. These are things that many families, especially some of the younger families we work with, they don't do many of these things well. And so in a brief amount of time, you can really bring up their abilities in these areas. More specialized skills involve identifying trauma and loss reminders at the family level. Whether it be, regardless of the severity of the trauma or loss event, there can be different triggers that provoke reactions in the kids and the parents. You put them in downward spirals or stress spirals. It's very helpful to work collectively with them to identify the individual and the family level triggers so they can have strategies for dealing. Next slide. Here's a case example drawn from our work at UCLA Medical Center. We have a family with sons 14 and 18 years old. The younger son contracted spinal cancer at age 7, lost the ability to walk. He had a series of extended hospitalizations, multiple surgeries and radiation. He did regain mobility, from some intensive work, including chemo and surgery. And then he had a period at home in which he rehabilitated. He had a number of years in which he was symptom-free, but then he found at school he was getting weakness in his legs again. This was through the buildup of necrotic tissue. When they came back to UCLA Med Center, there was a sign that they needed additional surgery. This sparked signs of client depression and actually family conflict. So next slide. What I want to look at here first are some of the timelines. We've got here's the mothers and fathers timelines that were a very simplification of those that were done in the initial sessions with the parents. Later, I've got the boys' timelines. Both brothers, and then also contrasting the fathers and the older son's time. They're the ones who had real conflict. In fact, they'd even come to blows shortly before coming to a program for our work. So here we've got the mother in red and the father in blue. Initially, there was a move in which the parents lived in the high desert. They were actually in the city, and then they moved out to the high desert. There was the father had lost jobs, so there's some real financial stress. So you see that event was slightly more stressful for the mom than for the dad. There was the time when the son was who's about 6.5 years old at this time, was playing on jungle gym. He jumped down from the jungle gym, and then he couldn't get up. So it was this real sudden onset of paralysis in the legs. And they went to numerous clinics to try to understand what was going on. They couldn't get a clear answer. In fact, they were even at one point even blamed that there might have been abuse somehow was involved in this. They came to UCLA Medical Center, and they quickly diagnosed spinal cancer, and they put him in inpatient right away. And, of course, this is, you see real peak types of stress here. Father was a little more out of it. There was some background of the father being kind of, because of the financial duress and there was drinking, that he was a little out of the family orbit. So he was a little less in tune with what was going on. In fact, after a while, the father felt overwhelmed, and he stopped coming to the hospital, and so was the mom who was carrying the load there at the hospital. We see a real stressful period of time in the hospitalization, and like I said, there's a lot of events here, but this is greatly simplified. The idea is, though, that he did improve. They were able to send him home, and at the same time, Dad found employment, so things got more stabilized in the home financially, and also in terms of their worry about their son. So their stress levels both went down at that point. But then over time, there was an increase in conflict with the older son. And Mother was very agitated about this. Father was less tuned into it until it turned into an actual fist fight with him. During this time of the increasing stress, especially for the mom, there's also a relapse in the sense that the son was also starting to lose strength in his legs again. So you see the different convergent and divergent points there. Let's go on to the next slide. Here's the two brothers. The younger son is the one that's actually in black here, and it goes down, dips down a lot. He's the one who had the spinal cancer, and the older son is the one at the top. Now, the big difference here you'll see is that for the older son, when his brother was hospitalized, he was sent to stay with his aunt. And at that point, you see his stress really stays at a high level throughout. This is something that his brother didn't know about. Actually, it was something that his parents were not tuned into either. They felt that, no, we managed our attention to both siblings, despite the fact that one was very ill. But in fact, and the father was angry actually when in the family session, when he heard that his son was really hurt that he had been sent away, and felt that he had been shunted to the side. And there was the mother, who was a very strong figure in the family. She said, Poppy, it looks like he was going without, and so she really had to constrain him because there was so much conflict with the older son. So we elicit these real differences in the brothers, so that they have their own sessions separate from the family sessions, so that they can start to as well talk about their differences and misunderstandings, and difficulties that they may have had in their relationship. On to the next slide. Here I've just kind of transposed or overlapped the father and son timelines, so you can see how out of sync they are at different points. Especially at the point where the father in the mid part, who's the blue line, he got his new job. He was doing well, or he felt things were going well, but there was still the sustained real anger from the older son that was apparent in the timeline that he was able to really speak to in our family session. And for them to start to talk with the mother's help about, they didn't really see things from his perspective because at the time, but now the family session helped them to kind of pull back in together. Next slide. So the outcomes of what I've shared with you is just kind of the use of the graphic representation of narrative. This is just one of the tools, but a really kind of central piece in helping to bridge estrangement in a family that's experienced a really very difficult or traumatic event. With there's many opportunities for misunderstandings and really dead ends of communication without ways to open that up. But in a fairly short way, a brief way, using a very structured approach like this, keep in mind that these narratives are not trauma exposure pieces. These are elements to bridge communication. So we're not doing really prolonged exposure for this narrative retelling. It is simply to open up the communication and to explore the misunderstandings and misattributions. The goal here is to appreciate individual experiences across the family, support more open communication and sharing of worries and fears, address ongoing interference of trauma loss reminders on parenting and family life. That is key. Parents work together to monitor their interactions and maintain consistent routines and develop positive coping skills to address current and future challenges. This family was able to, they had a lot of challenging situations, but they were able to really mobilized their strengths. The mother and father started to work closer together, you know, and through kind of sharing their difficulties. And Mom helped Dad to get a little bit more of the older son's perspective. The older son was about to move out of the house. He was able to stay in the house at that point. He had some very high-intensity sessions, however, I might add. Next slide. I just want to add here that some of our research work that is going forward, especially this is with the working with the military families. You know, we've seen about 220,000 family members over the last 3 years. And, you know, these are families with all levels of different types of trauma and loss exposure. A lot of it sometimes even prior and besides the military, they have pre-existing types of chronic types of trauma. We've done, you know, outcome studies, but also most recently we're putting out structural equation modeling studies of how these different components of the intervention interact. The idea is we have a family-centered resiliency training program. You see that in the left-hand box. Those are the core components, as I've described: psychoeducation and developmental guidance, developing shared family narratives, support open, effective communication, supporting effective coordinated leadership, and enhancing those selected skills. We are looking at, this is with a modeling study with, so we do pre-post plus 1 and 4 month follow-up for the parents and the children. We use such measures as the family assessment device for some of the family variables, strength and difficulty questionnaire for the kids. We also look at symptom levels in the parents using the BSI, brief symptom inventory, and looking at their PTSD levels. We have found that, you know, first of all, we've had very positive outcomes for both children and parents in this family-focused intervention. We wanted to see how the kind of the causal lines, how that fell out. And what we found was a mediated reaction to the positive child outcomes. This first study was looking at the child outcomes. That there is both a direct impact to improve child outcomes of the intervention, but also a very powerful mediated impact, which is through improvements in how the family and the parent were functioning. This, in a strong way, kind of confirms the general model that you can help individual family members through a program that focuses primarily on improving family resilient functioning through changing of the family and the parent domain. Next slide. It looks like I have come through this. Now it is time for our questions and discussion, and I think we have ample amount of time for that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Juliet and Bill. As Bill mentioned, we'll now move into the question-answer portion of the event. Again, those joining us via the web may present a question by clicking on the bubble icon in the upper left corner of the screen. And those joining us by phone can send an email to question@nctsn.org. One of the first questions that we have for Bill and Juliet is if you could go into some depth in terms of how participants can incorporate family resilience principles into their clinical practice.
Juliet, what do you think?
Well, I think for one thing, for me, it gives almost a mental template of issues to look at for the family. And when I say that, I'm looking at the issues on the family level that we've talked about: communication and communication blockers, family organization issues, family supports, and then you look at the interplay between the family and the resources available to them, the interplay between the family and the issues of the individual members. I'm thinking of a family that I'm working with currently where you have separate but interacting traumas, one to a child currently and one historically to a parent. And you need to think about the different issues that each poses and the ways in which each one is interfering with the family's ability to do the things that you've talked about, Bill, and how just providing psychoeducation can start unblocking a bunch of things.
Right. Yeah, I agree. And I think you can do these type of interventions, not just at the family level, but you can take, this general model that Juliet and I have been talking about, and you can apply it to whether you do individual practice, couples practice, working just with the kids, or even group work. This is a roadmap for trying to jumpstart and to bring online the family strengths and their ability to be resilient. So even if I'm working with a parent, of course, the psychoeducation as well as and developmental guidance, of course, but for them to even to look at the experiences maybe that they're struggling with, that they've come in for treatment, and just try to see it from the point of view of their children, or their other spouse, the other family members, to try to build in that perspective taking even in the individual work is key. And then there are the short list of specific skills that are most helpful to building the protective functioning of the family. And that can be done at an individual level as well. So I think it's a great template, as Juliet said, to be doing a lot of different work. And it can be kind of attached or to supplement your ongoing models of work as well. Regardless of your orientation, a piece of the pie, of the treatment pie, can be this family focus or resilience enhancing piece of it. It doesn't have to be the whole thing. It can be just a piece of it as well.
Well, I think I want to add that it certainly is in your presentation that it also involves a stance of not blaming parents and families that are under stress.
Right.
Because they may be contributing to a family member's distress, but they are themselves under distress.
Right.
So it's looking for the strengths and the way to support the strengths and sort of pull them out of the hole, as it were.
Right, and for even when they come in with a blaming or, identified patient kind of a scenario, to try to move them, and which can be difficult, to more of a systemic frame in which they're seeing how everybody is contributing to the problem, perhaps, and also potentially to the solution. That in and of itself, enhances some of the family capability and that cohesiveness. It makes possible the type of collaboration that serves resilience.
Mm-hmm. And that for the work that many of us are doing regarding trauma, the way in which trauma can interfere with the resilience process, the things that you so beautifully outlined, that just getting that out there so that it's not necessarily bad parenting, but a parent or a set of parents responding to trauma in an expectable way.
Right. So adjusting expectations for the parents, for themselves, but also for their kids to understand, how it has impacted them and, how it can vary depending on their age.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Thank you both. Our next question has to do with child welfare. And has there been any work or discussion about applying this to child welfare settings, for instance, in situations where there is a reunification with family or return home goal and working on enhancing family resilience towards that goal?
Well, I can just say very briefly, for the last about 9 months, we've been working through the Department of Mental Health, and we're getting a number of step families and also reunifications within the families. And this approach has been very helpful. A lot of times it's not the sole type of intervention that's appropriate, but it's really helpful. I'm thinking of this one case that I'm supervising now, in which there was the children were taken away from the mother due to drug use, and they were in a series of foster homes, and there was abuse in the foster homes that the kids experienced. And they've been just recently reunified, and the kids are having difficulty at school. Mother is, has been in drug treatment, and she's, doing her best, but there's this real kind of gulf between her and the kids. She brought them in, initially for just work for the kids because they seemed depressed, having behavioral difficulties at school. But through the screening, we said, hey, we think we can do some of this family-level resilience work, specifically, the narrative sharing, to try to open up communication for her to get a better sense of what the kids have experienced, because, the kids were real mum about, anything that happened. So we've just gone through, her narratives, and now with the kids, and now we're getting ready for the family piece, in which, the kids did share about the really, how angry they have been, and about the fact that, the one boy was choked and was really abused physically in one of the settings, and some of their real residual issues that they have. We're hoping that this is going to help to open up communication. In the family session, we'll deal with this in a supportive way. But the idea that, so through the narrative, and then through the emotion regulation training, through goal setting and problem-solving skills, and opening up the communication, that we can serve this family. Now, they need additional individual work, and they should get it, but a piece of it can be this type of family-level resilience enhancement.
Mm-hmm. And I think, Bill, that's a lovely answer to how it would apply.
Great, thank you. And this is a question that is very relevant to both of you in terms of discussing how this is utilized in chronic problems for a family as well as in an acute experience such as a natural disaster or terrorist attack, etc.
I mean, I think that the people who have done a lot of this are the people at the Fit Center in Baltimore, where even when you have situations that are ongoing and chronic, the same shopping list pertains. That you're looking for identifying the pockets of competence. You're looking at identifying the stressors that have existed on the multiple levels of the family, providing the resources then. And that's a very simplistic one. Bill, do you want to give more detail?
Yeah, with chronic types of whether we work with chronic illness. We haven't worked with chronic or systematic types of abuse. That's one of the with the kind of that can be an exclusionary criteria for the type of work we do if there's like active or unresolved types of domestic violence or abuse. But chronic difficulties, you've got a much more kind of entrenched types of issues, sometimes greater estrangement and divides across the family system. There can be some really problematic adaptations to that, so that there's different types of tension reduction behaviors that we've often found, drug or alcohol use. People are really kind of spun off from the family. We have to go with where the family is and have a real keen understanding for the ongoing stress and load that they're dealing with. I'm thinking of some of the cases in which a parent is dealing with a chronically ill child, and that this is some of the cases there has been real marital schism as a result. So they come in with a certain kind of framing of the issue. The first thing is to really to understand and to communicate to them that we get the picture, that this is a real tough haul that they're dealing with, and then to try to make some appropriate goals for them. But we try to help them to frame their goals in terms of the family. What would be most helpful? What type of support would be needful? What kinds of things are doable? So we start getting our arms around the issues. Try to get some realistic short-term, then maybe intermediate, and longer-term goals framed with the family. And then we start with the psychoeducation about the impact of this type of chronic distress and load. and with the narrative work, and do that in a sensitive way. So we have done it with these cases. It can be more difficult, and we can be more humble in what we can accomplish with them. The goal, though, is to come up with a coping strategy to try to bridge the communication and the support as much as possible. The hard thing sometimes is to bring all of the family members in, and there can be some real kind of resistance to that, or it can be difficult to do that. But we find it useful even for 1 or 2 sessions, and to then get a plan going forward about how they can work together.
So a couple of additions, and again, not even always bringing everyone in together, sometimes working through parents, for example, that sometimes you have a juggling act that a family-level solution may or may not be the ideal solution for each individual family member.
Right.
I'm thinking of an issue of a child with some major disabilities, but there are some impacts on a sibling. So you need a balancing act that takes into account the needs of that sibling.
Right on. That is exactly true. And I'm also thinking of some of the cases we're doing at UCLA Medical Center. We're part of what's called Operation Mend, and these are the military members who have the most severe types of facial and hand injury. And through a private donor in Los Angeles, all of these guys are flown out there to get free reconstructive surgery, which some have 60, 70 surgeries, and they're flown out here. They stay at what's called Tiverton House, and they're here over years. We're doing the family piece of that work with these folks, and so this would qualify clearly as a kind of a chronic stressor, trauma, load to the family. And we work often in a home setting, if at all possible. We have to deal with the fact that there's likely to be serious depression and different types of disorders, including substance use for both spouse and the service member. And then we have varied ability to work with the whole family. Sometimes the kids are not out, and so we can just work through some of the work, while they come out for the surgeries with the service member. Then we'll get the spouse, and then sometimes we'll get the kids. So we have to take what we can. But even with that kind of narrow window, we find that this is still an important part of their recovery program overall, and to bring online the type of support that is most helpful for their recovery.
So I want to also think a little bit about the larger system and educating the larger system on how they interact with families under stress. I think back of work that Sandy Kaplan and David Pelkovitz did with the court system in New York, where there was the assumption that if there was family violence in a family and the abusive parent was removed, the children were still removed from the victim parent because the parent had somehow not succeeded in protecting the child, even though the child wasn't, the parent hadn't the capacity to do it. It wasn't possible.
Right.
And David and Sandy got the court to revise that policy to say the parent is also a victim. The child is best off with that parent, and then to facilitate their recovery together rather than plunging them into yet another set of potential losses.
Right. Very good. And we do the similar type of kind of outreach consultation in the communities as well, in which we want to do training with the providers about using kind of a broader family frame for their work. We find that that's an important piece of it as well.
Thank you so much. The next question is more around resiliency skills. How do you select family resiliency skills, if you could give some specific examples, and how do you enhance them?
Okay. Bill, do you want to start it? Do you want
Sure, I'll start. First thing is we do an assessment of what skills the family already has. One of our main catchphrases is positive asset search. We want to identify what they're already doing well, and even past types of traumatic events that they have successfully dealt with, even in a small way that they've adapted to, or being able to support each other, etc. So we want to highlight those as already existing skills. And then in the process of the initial sessions, we get a sense of what they have and what they could really use. We have that kind of short list of primary skills that, just based on our work and our research and kind of culling the literature, that we found most important. So we do assess for emotion regulation at the individual level, but also at the collective family level too. And that's something that families kind of naturally use if they're functioning well, if there's kind of open support, communication, etc., if there's engagement. Sometimes that is not working at the family level. So we want to assess emotion regulation, emotional awareness across the family system, for how well are parents tuned into what's going on with their spouse and also with the kids, and vice versa. Get a sense of that. We can, like we do in family therapy, we kind of rev up the family to see how they talk together. And actually the way we're doing the work at the Department of Mental Health work and through the LA Unified School District, we have the capacity to do home visits for our initial contacts. So you really see them working and talking and in their natural surroundings, so we get a sense of what they're able to do. We see what type of collaborative skills do they have. Sometimes the culture of families vary a lot. Sometimes the kids are not part of any adult conversation. Sometimes they're over-involved in adult conversations. So there can be poor boundaries, or there can be just a lack of engagement with the kids. Well, of course, we respect cultural differences and how they choose to run their family. We can try to tweak things if we think there's an openness or a utility for it. So we might even, in terms of testing, we do these experiments in terms of the homework. We can assign a family meeting, and we give them we have a handout and a structure for how to do a family meeting on a certain, can be a fun thing, for them to do a certain activity that they like together, to see if they can do that, to see if they can perhaps talk about an issue together. We want to give them skills that they can sustain after we're out of the picture. So we're assessing, and we're providing experiments to see how they do, and we're trying to build on their skill set. And so that includes, like I say, the emotional regulation things, as well as certain communication things, collaborative family skills, which include goal setting and problem solving. The thing about managing triggers and reminders is really important, especially from the trauma point of view, for them to be able to, in the individual sessions and as a family, to identify their triggers, things that, it doesn't have to be like a dramatic thing where, like for dad is triggered, when he's reminded of being in war or something like that, or when the brother, when they drive by the hospital and he starts to go into a funk and maybe has some level of re-experiencing or intrusive thoughts, ideation. It doesn't even have to be that strong. It can be just certain triggers go under the radar, and there's very subtle shifts in awareness that undermine what's going on in the family, undermine the parent's ability to be attentive, to be present, or the kids can become suddenly irritable or grouchy for no reason until you track it back to there was a certain kind of a triggering situation. So the key thing, though, is to put that in the hands of the family so that they can recognize and anticipate triggers and then have their own coping plan. Like, oh, that's just, that's dad, he's driving like a madman right now, and it's scaring us to death, which we see on the bases when the guys come back and then they are driving very fast and they're watching for things on the side of the road. So, but they have a plan. Okay, we're going to, Dad, you're driving like that, let's, let Mom drive or something like that, or we can all do deep breathing together. We have different types of plans for dealing with different triggered situations. So there's different types of strategies for bringing skills on board or upgrading existing skills. We do know the ones that seem to be most important, and that's the short list we provided. Juliet, any thoughts about this?
I think that you've done a beautiful answer. I think that the other thing you seeded before is the developmental awareness. That the skills that we're talking about can be taught to preschoolers, but they're a little bit different. And the parents have to be aware that preschoolers can get triggered as well. They're not necessarily just acting out.
Right.
So how you get people problem solving and on the same team.
Right.
Yeah, another one that I've seen recently is when you have a situation where one parent has a background of chronic stress and avoidance, what that does to family communication. But then just putting that out there and identifying it, not as insensitivity, but as a trauma response that needs to get worked on.
Excellent. Yeah, that is key. In terms of emotion regulation, we do simple things like we have these little refrigerator magnets that are like a thermometer with different green, yellow, orange, and red zones on it. And people can use this, things like this to just give the family a vocabulary to talk about their feeling states, what zone they're in right now, what do they need. And we just provide some very basic ways for families to communicate about those types of issues. That's all part of family-level emotional regulation.
Bill, there's another example that Esther Cohn did in Israel that's very similar. She's working with families in, I'll get the name slightly wrong, but it's a community where they have constant shelling. And she's worked with mothers and preschool children. And again, in a group setting, they've developed exercises and magnets with sayings that you can put on the refrigerator that are reminders of some of the things that they've learned.
Right.
So that they can deal with emotion regulation under situations of high stress and do it almost automatically because you've practiced it and you've got these magnet reminders on the refrigerator.
Awesome. Very cool.
Thank you so much. In line with the previous conversation, do you have a specific measure that you use to assess emotional regulation or a measure for collective family regulation?
No.
Let's see. Specific measures. Well, we use the strength and difficulty questionnaire for all the kids in a family, and that shows that it's a nice thing because it shows adaptive functioning at school and at home. The kids fill it out if they're 11 years old and older, and the parents fill out for the older as well as for the younger kids. And it looks at emotional reactivity. It looks at even pro-social behaviors as well, how well they communicate or how well they can be supportive in different situations. So that's one of the formal measures for for those skills.
On a couples level, there is the FIKES. I'm blocking on what the FIKES actually stands for, but it's a very brief measure of the extent to which individuals perceive themselves as supported by the family. In a couple setting, some people use the dyadic adjustment scale.
Right. We also use the Kid Cope. I know it's hard. There's like 12 different ways to score this thing, but it gives you a really good sense of the coping repertoire of young folks, the adolescents and younger folks. And it includes, positive types of coping as well as negative types of coping, as well as you can break down into different categories. And just the number of ways that kids endorse gives you a sense of, their repertoire, what they're able to do. We also use, in terms of family-level coping, we like the McMaster Family Assessment Device. That seems to do a nice job, and it includes a lot of the categories that we consider kind of resilient family functioning categories, which include kind of affective engagement, communication, support, cohesiveness of the family. And so, in fact, that's what we use for some of our outcome measures apart and get a sense of what are the kind of the primary resilient processes going on in the family.
Thank you very much. We have several questions around cultural considerations. Can you talk a little bit about areas that you need to be particularly sensitive or aware of when applying this to families from different cultures, specifically ones that are different from the clinician?
I think two that are particularly important are family belief systems, who's responsible for what, and family structure. That the clinician may have expectations about what's appropriate hierarchy, what's appropriate sex role, delineation, things of this sort. And I think you have to be very careful before you go in and say, well, this isn't fitting my expectations. To say, but how does this fit with the cultural piece of all of this?
Right. Yeah, I'd agree with that. A lot of times I've learned these things by blowing it, by making mistakes. In the early days of doing some of this kind of family work, I have either moved too fast or I had certain assumptions about people from different cultures. A lot of times I was working in community settings and I was doing the family work through translation, which is a difficult thing to start with. But then I found, the speed with which I'd be join with the family, it varied a lot. What did I have to have in the bank with them before we could move forward, as well as, like Juliet is saying, the cultural expectations for level of openness, or what traditional versus what we can I consider more non-traditional types of things. If I'm trying to enhance real openness and want to bridge a possible estrangement between an adolescent teen and a parent, thinking that what I think would be ideal would be for the child to be able to really say openly, what's going on. I'm thinking of a couple of cases with some families recently from Latin America, and I remember I really stepped on the toes of the parents. I went too quick, and my expectation with the level of openness was not what they felt comfortable with or wanted. And so I had to backpedal very quickly.
So there's another kind of circumstance that I don't know that we stop and think about so often, but I'm coping with one currently where the parents themselves are from very different cultural backgrounds. So you end up, in the process of doing this work, also being a culture broker.
And that might be some of the important work that needs to be done. And maybe these things were never really, dealt with in an overt way, but that's an important piece of the work.
Yeah. Because families don't necessarily say, well, my background expects X, Y, and Z, and yours expects A, B, and C, and you're now in the midst of a family that's in crisis because of a focal stress.
Right.
And you've got this very different set of expectations of where extended families are involved, how people communicate, whether a father who's a good provider is doing what he needs to do, even though he's not doing a lot of verbal emotional support.
Right.
So it gets complicated when you're both having to understand each system and then help the parents translate to each other. I mean, it's classic family therapy work. There's a whole tradition, but it's still there even if you're doing trauma work.
I agree, and I think you've got, it's like on a spectrum, cultural differences even between, let's say, spouses. You have formal differences in their upbringing. Let's say they can be from very different ethnic and cultural groups, but even different families and upbringings, they're kind of their own different culture anyhow. So part of our work sometimes is to look back at, the family of origin. How did they do it when you grew up? Even if they're from the same ethnic group, they can have some real diversity there, and still trying to bridge that as well. It's complicated stuff.
But that's the fun of it.
Yes. Are we at the end of our time? Or?
We sure are. Thank you so much, Juliet and Bill, for your wonderful presentation, sharing your experiences and insights. I'd like to thank all of our attendees for joining us today, and to remind you to fill out your post-presentation survey. You can download the slides from today's presentation in approximately 24 hours. This concludes today's presentation.
Thank you all, and bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.